Hello, everyone. We're here for chapter 24 now. And as we begin, I'd just like to encourage everyone to remember uh, every day check your Gmail and also um, check your Canvas every day as well. Um, okay, let's start in on chapter 24. Um, and chapter 24 then is the last chapter that we're going to cover uh, in terms of evolution. And in chapter 24, we're going to cover a little bit about what it is to be a species, the definition of a species, and also how evolutionists think maybe different species, new species actually come about. And maybe groups that are larger than species, like families and classes and things. Um, so when mentioning Charles Darwin again, when Charles Darwin was thinking about um, trying to figure out how species change through time, he referred to that as the mystery of mysteries. Uh, And remember that the Galapagos Islands are off off the western coast of South America, roughly in the area of Ecuador. And he discovered a lot of different plants and animals that were found nowhere else on Earth, and wondered what implications that had. For example, he found this type of flightless bird in the Galapagos Islands. Well, if the Galapagos Islands are about 600 miles off the coast of South America, then how could flightless birds have found their way there? Of course, well, there are also giant tortoises in the Galapagos Islands. So, another very valid question is if these tortoises came from the mainland, how could they have found their way to the Galapagos Islands? So then, and so on the Galapagos Islands, Charles Darwin made a lot of observations that later on led him to think about and come up with ideas about how new species come from existing species, and the process. There's a scientific name for that. The process by which one species splits into two or more species is called speciation. How do new species come about from existing species? And remember, we talked about microevolution in the last chapter. So microevolution basically is changes in allele frequencies, changes in how common different alleles are over time. And of course, what they mean by over time is from generation to generation. And so that's microevolution. And I think last chapter I hinted that, well, if there's something called microevolution in biology, then probably there's something called macroevolution that they talk about and think about and theorize about as well. And that's true. So macroevolution then is broad patterns, more dramatic changes in species, changes generally above the species level. Of course, really it should be at the species level and above the species level, because technically microevolution is not really change at the species level necessarily, or unless it's change at the species level that's not really creating new species. And so speciation then kind of bridges between microevolution and macroevolution, because there's, in order to have macroevolution, you've got to have some sort of change in allele frequencies from generation to generation. And here's an interesting video on macroevolution that you can watch on your own time. That is, it does a lot of good things to actually established the foundation for understanding of speciation. Species, the actual word species or species, as some people call it, is a Latin word just meaning kind of a general word, kind or appearance. Because in the early days, the different species were distinguished by their appearance. They couldn't do DNA analysis. In the early days of classification of living things into different species and different genera and families and so on. So biologists compare a lot of different things when they group organisms into different groups: phylum, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. They look at a lot of things when they classify organisms into different groups. So they look at morphology. And so what is morphology? Morph. What is morph? Actually means form. And so when a biologist uses the term morphology, what they mean is the anatomy. What size and shape and color. What form is some sort of individual taking, or actually they talk about morphology of individual organs as well, or morphology of tissues. So it might not be, morphology might not be the appearance of a whole living thing. It might be appearances of just parts of the living things as well. And then physiology. Physiology is basically how the bodies of living things operate. How is the blood circulated? How are nutrients distributed all through the body? How does the body digest the food that it takes in? That's all physiology, how the body works. And so this is what form the body takes, and this is how the body works. And then biochemistry, all the different, hundreds of thousands of different chemicals that make up the cells and the bodies of living things. And then DNA sequences, of course, the genetic code, the DNA sequences on the chromosomes and in the genes. So they look at all sorts of things when they group organisms into, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, all of those different groups, or domains as well. Remember there are 3 domains of living things. So they take all of that into account then. And so what is a species? And, one of the most important concepts probably in biology is what is a species? And through time, the word species has been defined in different ways. Currently, we talk about mostly the biological concept, biological species concept. So to put it kind of succinctly, then it's a group of populations whose members have the potential to interbreed. Maybe they're not breeding now, but has a potential to interbreed between the different populations in nature and produce viable, fertile offspring. And also they do not breed successfully with members of other such groups. And so there's a reproductive isolation from other species. If 2 things are really 2 different species, they should not be able to interbreed and have gene flow between them then. So gene flow between populations holds a species together genetically. And so there's now here's this looks like the North Dakota state bird almost. I don't think it is though, but here are 2 different birds of 2 different species. There's a lot of similarity between these 2 different species, and then kind of the opposite concept. There's a lot of diversity within a species. So all human beings are the same species, but yet that there's all sorts of diversity within the human species, and diversity not just physical diversity, but also behavioral diversity and all sorts of things. So there's different species can be similar, but within one species there can be a lot of diversity, and within all sorts of other species you can see a lot of diversity as well, especially species that we're really familiar with, like horses and cats and dogs and things. And then here's a video on Galapagos tortoises, but it actually just kind of shows it moving a little bit. You see a close-up of it, and then later on in the video you see it moving a little bit, but that's about it. I guess that's exciting if you're a scientist that studies tortoises. But anyway, another video then. I think they enjoy putting a lot of videos in these PowerPoints. So then if two different groups of living things are really two different species, then there should be reproductive isolation between those different species. For example, grizzly bears and polar bears, both of them are large bears, but clearly there's a morphological difference, difference in form between a grizzly bear and a polar bear. But the thing is, are grizzly bears and polar bears really different species, or are they the same species? Well, is there reproductive isolation between them? Also, tigers and lions, are they really different species? Do they really have reproductive isolation? What about horses and donkeys? Are they reproductively isolated? Or different types of sunflowers, are they really, or different types of grasses? Kentucky bluegrass and crabgrass, are they really reproductively isolated? So what is reproductive isolation then? A fairly simple concept. So reproductive isolation means that there are biological factors, barriers, and we'll talk about them at length in the next few slides, but there are biological factors that impede or prevent two species from producing viable fertile offspring. In other words, two different species can maybe produce offspring, but are those offspring really viable? That is healthy, and are they fertile? Can those offspring produce offspring? So hybrids, you probably heard that term before, especially in relation to agricultural crops. But hybrids are the offspring that result from the mating between different species. But actually, when you talk about like hybrid corn or other hybrid crops, those are actually produced by reproduction between two different varieties of corn, actually. But anyway, in a true biological sense, a hybrid though is results offspring that results from mating between two different species. So reproductive isolation then can be classified by whether factors act before or after fertilization, because there's a lot of things that can cause reproductive isolation before the act of fertilization, but then there are other things, other factors that can cause reproductive isolation after an egg has been fertilized, and so here's a diagram of all sorts of different barriers. 7 major types of barriers to cause reproductive isolation, and there's 4 of them that basically can be in place before. Actually, excuse me, 5. There's 5 of them that can be in place before fertilization. So it's called before fertilization or before a zygote is formed. Because remember, when one egg unites with one sperm, that first fertilized egg is called a zygote. So before fertilization or before the formation of a zygote, there are prezygotic barriers. There are 5 different prezygotic barriers. But then even if a zygote, even if fertilization is successful and a zygote is successfully produced, there are a lot of barriers there are barriers that cause reproductive isolation after fertilization, so post-zygotic barriers. And we'll look at examples of all these, and we'll go through them one by one. So these pre-zygotic barriers, by definition then, pre-zygotic barriers will block fertilization from occurring, so preventing fertilization from even occurring, either by impeding different species from attempting to mate, or preventing the successful completion of mating somehow, or hindering the fertilization, even if mating is successful. Even if they're physically able to mate and exchange egg and sperm, there are other things that hinder fertilization of the egg. So let's look at 3 different pre-zygotic barriers then. The first 3 in this from slide 12 that we first looked at. Habitat isolation, temporal isolation, and behavioral isolation. And so what they've got going here is, here's one species that's indicated by a blue sphere and another species indicated by an orange sphere. And, maybe there's a barrier that causes habitat isolation to prevent mating, or maybe temporal isolation prevents mating, or behavioral isolation prevents mating. But if these barriers are overcome, or if these barriers don't exist, then they will attempt to mate. So habitat isolation, first of all. Basically 2 species encounter each other rarely or not at all because they occupy different habitats. If they're always spending their time in different habitats, they're probably not going to encounter each other very much at all. So, they occupy different habitats, even though they're not really isolated by any sort of physical barrier necessarily. It's just that they prefer different habitats. And a good example of that is different fruit flies. Some fruit flies just love to be on apples, and others just love to be on hawthorns. And so they don't really cross paths because they're on 2 different trees, different types of trees. And then temporal temporal refers to time. Okay, temporal refers to time, and so there could be temporal isolation. Species that just breed at different times of day. They breed maybe at different seasons of the year, or maybe they breed at different years. For example, there's a 17-year locust and a 13-year locust, and so they're on different cycles when they're not out in the same year, most of the time anyway. And then when I was going through these slides at first glance, I thought, what is this? It kind of looks like a skunk, but then kind of looks like maybe a marten as well. I'm not quite sure what this thing is, but believe it or not, these are things called spotted skunks, spotted eastern skunks. So there are 2 species of spotted skunks live in the same area out east, but one mates in the summer and the other species mates in the winter. So they're, that's a temporal isolation, believe it or not. And then there's a behavioral isolation as well. A lot of species, like birds, for example, have complex courtship rituals that they have to go through before mating. And so courtship rituals or other behaviors that are unique to the species are effective barriers. And then they've got like 4 kind of enjoyable videos here. So I guess this is the video necessarily, but this type of bird, cormorant or whatever, has a certain type of courtship ritual. But the blue-footed boobies have a different type of courtship ritual. So they act kind of like this. Yeah, maybe these here are blue-footed boobies. Maybe that's what that is. But, so blue-footed boobies then have a definite sort of dance they go through for a courtship ritual. But the albatross has a very different courtship ritual, and you can watch those videos in their entirety if you like. And so, if a blue-footed booby were to encounter an albatross, well, the two different species are going to be doing totally different courtship rituals, and so they wouldn't mate because they think the other one's courtship ritual is totally crazy and doesn't make sense. Then like giraffes, and I think there's like two different species of giraffes. I don't know if they have different courtship rituals, but here's courtship ritual in giraffes, and of course, deer and moose and bison, elk, all a lot of animals have different courtship rituals then. So those are some of the pre-zygotic and pre-mating barriers. But also there can be mechanical isolation that can prevent mating, or gametic isolation. And let's look at mechanical isolation. Mechanically their bodies just can't mate with each other. So some sort of morphological, some sort of difference in form can prevent successful completion of mating. For example, there's a couple snails, a couple species of Bradybina snails. Their shells spiral in different directions. One shell spirals towards the right, and the other one spirals towards the left. And because of that, their genital openings can't align. So here's the genital opening of one, and here's the genital opening of the other one, and somehow they can't align. These snails just can't figure it out. Okay, so that's that's a mechanical isolation then, a reproductive barrier. Gametic isolation. So the gametes are not compatible. So sperm of one species may not be able to fertilize eggs of another species. For example, that it happens in sea urchins. These red spiny sea urchins, their gametes are not compatible with the blue spiny sea urchins. Then, so there are also then post-zygotic barriers. In other words, with sometimes different species can actually successfully mate and can actually produce a zygote, but things happen to the zygote that prevent it from really forming viable or fertile adults. You could have reduced hybrid viability, or reduced hybrid fertility, or you could even have hybrid breakdown. And we'll look at each of these then. So reduced hybrid viability, reduced hybrid fertility, and hybrid breakdown. So first of all, reduced hybrid viability. The genes of the different parent species may interact and actually impair the hybrid's development or survival in the environment. The genes just don't line up in the chromosomes, in the cells. For example, different subspecies of the Ensantina salamanders, then they can mate and produce hybrids, but the hybrids cannot develop to adulthood. So there could be reduced hybrid fertility. Even if hybrids are vigorous and viable and healthy, they may be sterile, just totally sterile. Probably the most well-known example then is a donkey and a horse can actually mate and produce a mule then. And mules are very healthy, very viable, and in some ways mules are actually more useful than either a donkey or a horse. And they seem to be more intelligent than horses. I don't know about donkeys, but they seem to be more intelligent than horses in many ways. So that's but they're fertile. They're infertile. They can't produce offspring. Now there could be hybrid breakdown. Some first generation hybrids are fertile and viable, but when they mate with each other or with either of the parent species, the offspring of that next generation are feeble and or sterile. And you get this with different rice plants of different species. Here's one parent species, here's another parent species, but the hybrids they produce, the hybrids they produce are fine, but then the hybrids, the offspring of those hybrids are not good. So basically, then those are barriers. Those are reproductive isolation barriers that are produced by a lot of different things that are happening in nature. So in part 2 of our lectures on chapter 24, we're going to start out then talking about the limitations of biological species concept. Until then, I will see you later, and I will record part 2 of my lectures on chapter 24 very soon, and I'll put them up very soon as well in Big Blue Button. As always, let me know if you have any questions or would like anything else further explained. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.